We just reviewed one major reason that concrete cracks, and that had to do with an outside force being applied to it and trying to bend it. But there's another reason that concrete cracks. Remember that if a force tries to pull the concrete apart, the concrete's going to crack when the stresses caused by that force exceed the concrete's tensile strength. Now, besides those external forces, there's also more of an internal force in the concrete working to pull it apart, and that is that concrete shrinks. Over time, and especially during that first 7 days where the hydration process is really running, and then in the next 28 days where it's still running but it's winding down a little bit, some of that water is being used up in the process and some of that water is leaving the concrete. And the concrete undergoes a measurable volume change. It shrinks, and there's really very little we can do about it. It's just part of the process. Hydration starts, water gets used up, the process puts off heat, and the concrete shrinks. That's just what it does. Now, in addition to this initial shrinkage, which really can be as much as a half an inch for a 100-foot long slab, the volume of a concrete structure can also change with weather. So cold shrinks it and heat expands it. These temperature changes might not have much of an effect on an enclosed structure, like a building where the temperature stays fairly constant because it's all enclosed, but it might have a really big effect on something like an outside slab or a parking structure that's exposed to the weather and undergoes all those volume changes associated with high and low temperatures. Now, let me explain how this works. If concrete were cast up in space where it was unrestrained, it would still shrink, but it wouldn't crack. Now think about it. If there was nothing to restrain it, it would just shrink towards the middle, and the volume change wouldn't cause cracking. But down here on Earth, there's always something restraining that volume change. So, for example, if I support a beam or a slab on some columns or walls, it's attached to those supports, and those supports are effectively trying to hold it there. As that beam or slab shrinks, it's being held at the end. And those shrinkage forces increase, and the concrete just eventually tears itself apart. This is what's known as a shrinkage crack. Now, if we go back down onto a slab on grade, a slab like the floor of a building or a tennis court, that restraint can come from friction. And so again, if the slab would just shrink from the outside to the middle, we'd end up with a slightly shorter slab, but without friction, it wouldn't crack. Because friction is restraining that slab's ability to shorten, though, these internal forces build up again and the slab pulls itself apart and cracks to allow those little smaller pieces to shorten. So the term restraint to shortening cracks is also used here to describe these shrinkage cracks in concrete. Now, in structural concrete that already contains enough rebar in it to reinforce against the bending that we expect to occur, there's often enough rebar already in place to reinforce against this type of cracking. But let's take a look at some other strategies that can be used, especially in something like a slab on ground that might not need any rebar in it to reinforce against those bending movements.